Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT show. This is our 187th show. That must be some sort of record, I guess. And we're delighted that you're able to all to join us tonight. We have, as we always have, another great show for you tonight. We've got an absolutely fantastic guest, and you'll be talking about this for a long time afterwards, I can guarantee it. But let me just restate that this, again, has been another great day for British democracy. Many people were staggered to see the Prime Minister rushing across the House of Commons floor this week to greet Nigel Farage. Who knows? But maybe he was, as some people suggested, greeting his new boss, because it's almost guaranteed that Farage is much closer to the next president of the United States than Keir Starmer ever will be. Also, we have news this week that the British government is banning ads for porridge. It seems that in the minds of some people, porridge is extremely unhealthy. As someone who has his porridge every day, this is a terrible blow, and I'm rather hoping that my health will recover sometime soon. We also learned this week that the cost of shipping 4 people to Rwanda, and I hope you're sitting down, please, because I hate to shock anyone unnecessarily. The shock of shipping 4 people to Rwanda is £715 million. Let me repeat that. The British government has spent £715 million transporting 4 people to Rwanda. In the meantime, it's reducing the fuel allowance for pensioners and introducing austerity. Whether all of these measures would have been necessary had they not spent £715 million on a failed Rwanda scheme is an interesting point. But that's British democracy for you. We also learned that there is to be an inquiry into COVID. You may recall Lady Moan and many others benefited amazingly and extraordinarily on the proceeds of providing COVID equipment of various kinds. There is to be a COVID inquiry. It will be headed up by the person who was in charge of the health department when they agreed to all of these extraordinary deals. So that's going to turn out well, I imagine. And also we learned this week that the Turks and Caicos Islands, which has an arrangement with the Westminster government, which is vastly superior to that of Scotland and Wales, even Northern Ireland for that matter, is now saying unless it gets a much better deal, they will declare independence. As I say, you could scarcely make this stuff up, but it's for real. Check it out for yourselves. Anyway, enough of that. Let's get to the meat of the show, because we need as much time as possible to talk to this guest as we can possibly contrive. We're going to be talking about Africa, energy and constitutionalism, and many other things besides. So without any further ado, let me welcome Tara O'Connor. Welcome, Tara. How are you?
I am very well, thank you, and delighted to be on your show. Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's a great pleasure to have you with us. Tell us a little bit about what you do.
Well, I run a small business, a consulting business, and have done so for nearly 20 years now, which operates across the continent of Africa. And we do 4 essential things. The first is to provide companies with advice on how to, where to invest, and what problems they may face. The second is we provide investigative due diligence services where we look into the potential business partners of people wanting to invest or expand or carry out projects across Africa. And we make sure that they're not getting into unsavory relationships that will come back and bite them later, sort of corrupt relationships, politically exposed relationships, or unfortunately now with sanctions everywhere, individuals that are sanctioned. And then we have a compliance service where, again, we build in the anti-corruption, build into corporate structures and so on, how to approach, how to operate without getting involved in any corrupt relationships and corrupt practices on the ground. And that involves training and encouraging and writing policy that people in country follow. And finally, we have an information service which covers 23 countries every month, soon to be going online.
Fantastic. That must keep you terribly busy.
It
Do you do
does. It has to be said.
do you do compliance training? I mean, do you work with companies and say, look, these
Yes,
are the
we
things you need to bear in mind if you're making contracts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Yes, so we will actually say to companies, this is the level of risk that you're going to face in, say, Kenya, very corrupt country. This is the sort of policies that you need to have in place from a legalistic point of view. And then we actually then go into country, or we run workshops with staff, executives and staff, so that they're both aware of what the risk is and how to avoid it, and practical steps of practical things to do not to get involved in any kind of corruption.
Now, some people might think, well, you must be terribly, terribly busy, because they might say Africa is a basket case. Therefore, it needs all the help it can get. What's your view on that view?
So now I've been operating as I am, I'm actually born and raised in Africa on the continent. So I'm of the continent, but obviously with a name like Tara O'Connor, of Irish parentage. So I have lived through the most extraordinary transition that's happened across the continent. Not just one transition, but two. So obviously I grew up in the immediate post-independence era. In Zambia, in one of the earliest independent countries in the SADC, Southern African region. But then also I was formerly a journalist, and in my early journalistic career, I watched as when the Berlin Wall fell, what people missed was just what an impact it had on Africa. And suddenly you had grassroots movements all over the continent, from Benin to Senegal to, right across the continent, demanding, with grassroots people chasing presidents out of office, literally, sometimes physically chasing them out of office, setting up constitutional conferences to chart a way to democracy, because democracy was what people wanted. They didn't want the old dictatorial one-party statism that had blighted and benighted the post-independence period until about the fall of the Berlin Wall in the early 90s. And then subsequently, with that, we've seen over the last sort of 20 or 30 years, in fact, that maturing of that democratic order. And I speak about, South Africa. We can talk about South Africa and its constitution, and how South Africa has weathered the its electoral storm, post-independence, or its liberation storm, if you like. But other countries in West Africa, like Senegal, where you actually now have the youngest leader that country has ever had, who and where the population basically insisted that the constitution would hold, and that they should hold elections as it should happen, and so on. So, there's been a flowering of democracy and a youthful movement that is very, very determined to stay democratic. And there's a wonderful organization, a very rare organization that operates out of Ghana, which is called Afrobarometer. And they go out and take public. It's one of the first organizations that ever bothers to ask people in Africa what they think. And they have gone out and they have taken polls right across the continent, and the majority of particularly the young, they say that they would rather have an inefficient democracy than go back to some kind of a dictatorship. So that's interesting.
So one of our questioners is asking, it's a sort of addendum to my question about, is Africa a basket case? He's asking, does Tara find that any of the African states are free of corruption?
So I would say Rwanda is reasonably, Transparency International puts a very good list of countries and where they are progressing in terms of corruption. And there are a number of countries at different levels, at different stages in their battle against corruption. Part of the issue about corruption is that it has to be acknowledged. And, while we would look at South Africa and say, oh, my goodness, it is corrupt. And yes, my goodness, under 10 years of Jacob Zuma's rule, the former president who has now broken away from the ruling African National Congress, he and his cohorts really instilled extraordinary corruption, stole trillions of rand, hundreds of millions of dollars, spirited it away out to, out of the country and into offshore havens and often into Dubai. But the real issue is that you've got the real thing is that, you had a commission of inquiry that actually looked into all of that. You have a wonderful woman called Advocate Thuli Madonsela, who wrote a report highlighting what was happening. She is the public protector. She's a constitutional role that she protects the public against the state, which is, I think, a very innovative institutional mechanism. She wrote a report highlighting where this corruption was being shown. A commission of inquiry was implemented, which actually looked into every aspect of it. And now there is the next level, which is the prosecutions are going ahead slowly, way too slowly for most people's liking. But it's harder to be corrupt, and it's harder to steal public funds in South Africa since that. And that's a progression.
And of course, corruption happens because there has to be two parties to it. Of course, there has to be the individual and the state that accepts the money or the largesse, but there has to be somebody who bribes. There has to be a briber and somebody who accepts the bribe.
That's absolutely true. And I think in a lot of countries, I think South Africa's case was particularly extraordinary because it's a very rich country. It had a very, very large national coffers. The national coffers in South Africa, ordinary South Africans are very, very good taxpayers. So they always have very good tax receipts. And so, as a lot of the corruption was what we would call state corruption. It even got a name. It was called state capture, and state capture, was what we would call grand corruption. And it was where Jacob Zuma put allies, and this is the danger of what's going on in the United States, is Jacob Zuma put allies and loyalists into state-owned enterprises, and the job was to feed him cash. And so that's where the state capture, the presidency was abused to state capture. But, you've had a number of milestones. One of the things, and again, it's companies like ours and it's companies themselves that work extremely hard. It does take two to tango. And nowadays, you have got these extra territorial legislation. So you've got in America since 1974, you've had the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Yeah.
In the UK, you have only since I think it was only ratified in 2011, that bribery abroad is illegal. South Africa has its own rules about, bribery abroad is also illegal. So bribery in the rest of Africa is illegal. And there have been some very big cases that have been prosecuted. But also these laws mean that international companies operating abroad really now do genuinely take care. They do their due diligence. They set up these programs. They actually try. So that's on that side. There is still a great deal of corruption in a country like Kenya, even between business to business, enormous corruption. But it is possible in most of, I would say, the most modern countries across the continent to operate completely cleanly without ever, and with the protection of the law, because the great thing to be able to say in a country that is riddled with corruption is, I'm sorry, if I pay that, I'm going to go to jail in England, And people who have bribed and who have been investigated under the UK Bribery Act, the actual sentences are significant. We're talking 10, 15 years in prison for bribing ministers. So it's a great deterrent, those laws.
So your feeling is that there was a lot of corruption in Africa. That's true.
Yep.
But that degree of corruption is lessened. It's lessened. It's less now than it was before.
Yes.
And you put that down to the fact that the countries have gone through some, I would call them birth pangs. I think that's a
yes. Yes. And
then they've reached a stage now where they have developed constitutions that make it much more difficult for the state to acquire monies that it shouldn't acquire. Players who are interested in acquiring state assets illicitly, and that you put that down to the strength of the new constitutions that have come into place in Africa. Is that right?
There has been an extraordinary. I mean, again, the one thing I would just say is that the youth. I mean, the average age of the mean age in Africa is 19. So we are talking about a hugely youthful population, and we're talking about a hugely youthful and connected population.
Yeah.
So there are something like 700 million cell phones in a continent of 1 billion people. You have absolutely super connectivity. You can connect on a WhatsApp group from someone in Nigeria to someone in Kenya in absolutely easily. Everybody has access to what we have here. This is extraordinary in the most remote areas of the continent. So people are very connected, and the young, the youthful are getting political. They see that it is still a shocking figure. There's something like $100 billion is taken offshore. Some of that is corruption. A lot of it is tax evasion. Some of it is tax avoidance that is quasi-legitimate. And the tax systems, tax relationships across Africa definitely need to be looked at in order to keep that money on the continent and being invested on the continent and not offshore, which is a problem. But certainly constitutions. This youth has actually been the driver behind lots of constitutional change. And the big example that I will give is Kenya. So Kenya in 2007 had an almost national meltdown after yet another set of rigged elections by a very small political elite that actually contained all political power unto themselves, if you like. And that included budgetary power. And the crisis came when, elections, there was such a gap between presidential and parliamentary elections that everybody knew the elections had been stolen in 2007. And almost immediately afterwards, the losing faction set about stoking political violence. And the political violence ended up, I think 1,500 people were killed, 350,000 people were displaced into tents, and the economy very disrupted. Economy dropped basically 7%, GDP went into a negative. And out of that crisis, and actually the late, great Kofi Annan was responsible for being the mediator. And part of his solution was that a constitution that had been built and designed by civil society groups, legal activists, and so on, would then come into play. And that would be part of the negotiated settlement. And so in, I think, August 2010, the new constitution, which is quite a remarkable document that was 20 years in the making, was put before the people in a referendum, and it was voted by 60% of the population. And thereafter, you've had this constitutional renewal in Kenya. And one of the impacts that it has on corruption is that it has taken away the total centralizing of power over the budget from the presidency. And in the new constitution, one of the most innovative things about the new constitution is no matter what the presidency and the ruling party sets as a budget, a guaranteed 15% of that budget has to go to the provinces, never seen before. And so, you get sort of really unusual things, like there was this one northern province or northern county in Kenya that has been waiting for a tarred road for since independence, has now got a tarred road because their governor has the money to be able to do that. So, but not only that, a real separation out of an independently appointed judiciary, which is obviously critical. And you've had a number of things under the new constitution that have been very surprising. I think the 2017 elections were also considered to be very fraudulent, and the new Supreme Court unprecedentedly cancelled them and forced them to be rerun. So, we're talking about not just institutional renewal, but we're talking about constitutional rooting. And we've seen that in South Africa again with the last elections, the incumbents losing their dominance and having to go into a coalition government that's quite centrist. So
I love the idea of having a constitution that guarantees counties their own spend.
Yeah.
I mean, because of all the places that you look across, I mean, the UK is probably the most centralized country in Europe.
It absolutely is, and it's that you don't get a sense of empowering anybody or any sense of equality really with that.
Let me just touch up on immigration, if I may, because it's a big issue in the UK.
Yeah.
Scotland feels there's not enough of it. Everyone else feels there's far too much of it. And I think what drives some of the Scottish sentiment might be, at least in part, the fact that across the NHS, every one nurse in four is not local, as it were, not from the country. So they're immigrants. But the people who are ill-disposed to immigration say, look, this is what happens when the benevolence of the British Empire collapses, and these people can no longer call upon the support of Great Britain. They revert back to savagery, and therefore it produces enormous migration, and we have to deal with the consequences of that ineptitude on the part of African nations. What's your answer to that?
So my answer to that is that certainly the empire, I think most of the former colonies are very much happier now and much more developed than they ever were as colonies. I think the country that I grew up in was Zambia. Its main output was copper, and at independence it had one qualified engineer. one Zambian qualified engineer, and everything else was expatriates. So there was a neglect. There was a much smaller population. It has to be said, there has been a population explosion across the continent. And that is to do with extraordinary advances in healthcare, and in healthcare. I mean, incredible advances now in malaria. Children previously would not survive over, after lots of 1 to 5 deaths between 1 and 5 years of age. Not so anymore. But also the whole continent has got a lot richer. What people don't realize is that until COVID, the African continent was the fastest growing continent, behind it, but only pipped by Asia, and marginally pipped by Asia. So we were talking in some countries of having 10% economic growth, like Ethiopia. Next year, we're going to see countries like Namibia, with a tiny population, growing at sort of 8 to 10%. Senegal growing at 8%. So the picture of poverty and misery and so on, and a lot of the migrants that happens, a lot of the migration that happens in Africa is within Africa. There are about 16 million people at any given time on the move to the capitals of, the mega capitals of Kinshasa, Lagos, Nairobi. And those parts of the country have got higher growth rates, and they are actually sucking in quite a lot of investment these days. So it's quite but we do have, because we've got this issue, and that's a stoked up issue, I'm afraid to say, by the ultra right, and this is a power play, I think, by Russia. It's part of the Russian propaganda that makes everybody feel uncertain, and it's no surprise that people like Madame Le Pen, who was formerly financed by Russians, is the main progenitor for, the main proponent of anti-immigrant. I mean, if you translated some of the things that Le Pen says and compared them side by side with some of the things that Mr. Farage says, they're almost the same.
Yeah.
So there is an external fact, and we see this in Africa, that actually we have had Russian involvement in the 3 countries of the Sahel: Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The 3 main Sahelian countries that actually ordered French and European, French, EU, and UN troops to leave. And the only result of that is to create a very unstable environment. Basically handed over those 3 countries partly to the control of Tuareg rebels and ISIS and Islamist insurgents. And those Islamist insurgents are doing what I think Russia wants, which we have seen is creating refugees.
Yeah.
Similarly, in Sudan, you've got Russia and the United Arab Emirates backed RSF rebels. They're called the Rapid Support Force rebels, but they are the old Janjaweed genocidal killers of Darfur that we remember. Yeah. They've just now dressed up in smart uniforms funded by Russia. Yeah. And they have created 2 million people displaced into refugee camps in Ethiopia, in Uganda, and in Kenya, and also moving north into Libya. Yeah. So, already and waiting in probably in 18 months' time to become the weaponized flow across to Europe, and probably organized and orchestrated and facilitated by Russia, just as you've seen on the borders of with Belarus and so on the far eastern borders of Europe. But coming back to your question, so that's the situation. But coming back to your question, I just my argument against this anti-immigrant thing is mainly economic. If we want to have growth in Europe, we have a declining population, aging population. I talked about the average age in Africa is 19. The average age in Europe is 47. There is an economic gravity that is being denied there, and also, those of us who are coming up to pension age, we need migrants to continue boosting the economy so that we can have a happy old age.
There's a lot of misconceptions around, and I want to deal with two of them. One is that some people believe that their pension is held in trust somewhere. They don't realize it's paid out of their current account.
Yes.
Yes. And it's always a shock when people learn that, because they thought, hold on a second, I've been paying tax for all these years. Yes. There must be a pot somewhere that the government keeps. And I have a portion of that pot. Yes. No, you don't.
No, you don't.
It's paid out of the current account. And if that current account is not being augmented, then you're in real trouble.
Yes.
The other thing I want to touch upon, if you could just spend a couple of minutes just talking about this, I think people are very confused about the size of Africa, because they sit at home with a Mercator map, and it shows them that everything in Northern Europe, they are accustomed to that, and they see this little lump at the bottom called Africa. And I don't think for a second they realize how big Africa really is. Give us an example of how big Africa is.
It's vast. It is an extraordinarily large continent, and you can fit most of the rest of the world in it if you put it all in it. And if you want to get a real size, the Peters projection map is probably the best, is it not?
Yeah.
But I was talking to a client at one point, and I was trying to get across to them what this sense of size, and they were operating in a mine site to the north of one of the provinces of Democratic Republic of Congo, and the area they were concerned about was at the other end of that province, just one province within Congo. And I just described it as, well, if your mine site is where Calais would be, and the problem area that you're talking about is where Marseille is. And that's within one province of 9 provinces within Democratic Republic of Congo. So multiply France 9 times and you've got one country. So
amazing, isn't it? Now, you talked earlier about the influence of Russia.
Yes.
What about the influence of China in Africa?
China's influence is enormous, and one cannot argue with what China has done across the continent. I mean, I think I spoke to you about this sort of earlier about the average growth rates really were, that we were talking average growth rates, including some of the very difficult countries like Zimbabwe. And that was averaging 5% continent-wide before COVID. And that would not have happened if it hadn't been for China's investment on the continent. They have been building ports, railways, roads at enormous speed across the continent. And so, and they have unleashed, the Chinese investment is absolutely responsible for the unleashing of economic growth on the continent. And they are Africa's biggest trading partner as a result. So we are talking 280 million, the value of trade in 2023 was something like nearly 300 billion, compared to America's 70 or 80 billion. So, and what's behind that? And I think one of the things that we absolutely have to acknowledge is that China set its sights about 15 or 20 years ago on taking control of the vehicle markets, the global vehicle markets, which they have effectively done. And And in order to do that, and also this energy transition that we're going through at the moment, that who the world's winners are going to be those that dominate in that market. And that's what a lot of this fight with China behind Russia and the mid-ranking countries in alliance is all about. But China has basically got control of the main battery producing elements in Africa, for example. So lithium all over.
Lithium, yeah.
Lithium, and most of the minerals that you absolutely need have got Chinese ownership or part ownership of them. Iron ore, copper, all of that, of which Africa has an abundance. And so, so Africa is central to China, and you see Russia's involvement very much. Russia's is both ideological; it wants to reintroduce the Soviet Union's sphere of influence, those countries that were within its sphere of influence in the Soviet days. It's trying to bring those back in with. By supplying arms, but usually by just getting their person, their man mainly, and protecting that person, suppressing opposition, using propaganda to actually support the military takeovers in 5 countries in the Sahel, being the prime example. But all of that is in an area which is very rich in uranium. So Russia is also seeking uranium deposits to take control of the areas of uranium deposit. And today in the news, we saw that one of the client states, Niger, which has one of the biggest uranium deposits that was previously owned and run by a French company, has been expropriated just today by the Nigerian military government. So it's very it's strategic, and unfortunately, Europe is way behind. It's only been in the last 5 years that in my sphere, my world, I have seen the European Union coming out to actually scope and find out where these minerals are. Their data is not even up to date about where the minerals are. So
They left it a bit late because
a little bit late.
And I gather, for example, China is now describing the route through Latin America, South America, rather, through Africa, etc., as the second Silk Road.
Yes.
I mean, that suggests organization, that suggests a long-term plan, and that suggests that they have specific targets in mind. You don't spend all that money and you don't put in all these resources unless you're absolutely convinced that there's a gain at the end of it.
No, you're absolutely right. And this is, I have watched as China has built its plan and built its plan. I mean, and it's been very strategic. So, for example, in the early days, you would see president, they have every couple of years, they have invite all the presidents to Beijing, and then deals are done in Beijing. But that is very strategic. Not only do they bring the presidents, but they have the finance ministers, they have several different annual events where all the ministers of Africa are treated as one country, actually, which is I'm not in favor of. But behind them, all the journalists of Africa get invited across en masse. And friends of mine who've actually gone on the sort of press junkets to China have not been named after their newspaper, the Business Day or This Day from Nigeria, but Mr. Nigeria and Mr. South Africa. So assuming that all press is government controlled and owned, which is one of China's big mistakes about Africa.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting dynamic that China and African democracy is very rooted, in my view. And China doesn't understand it. That's one of the big gaps. And I think that's one big gap between China and African governments. And I wonder if that isn't in the future going to be a point of pressure between the continents.
Now, I think you're the very best person to answer this question.
Yes.
Looking at the president-elect's views on tariffs and how he might direct his concerns at China, what impact do you think that might have on Africa if there are tariffs placed on China?
Well, I think, first, I think China is already prepared for that. So China has already done a set of deals with various African countries that have got quite good electricity to start supplying them with electric vehicles. So electric vehicle sales is the next level, I think, for China to push. Africa in itself might be very badly affected by the tariffs because next year there is a special trade deal between, trade arrangement called AGOA, AGOA that's signed between a number of African countries and China. And America, I beg your pardon. And that comes up for renewal in 2025. And I don't think that Donald Trump really cares about it. He's never been to Africa. It's going to be what's in it for the United States rather than this is a trade deal that allows African countries to have open access to the American market. But I think China has already seen Africa as the big opportunity. But China will be in competition because as America disregards Africa and makes no effort, the countries that are making an effort are the Gulf countries. So China has competition from Turkey, from UAE, and from other Middle East countries that are investing. Saudi Arabia is looking at investing in ports, competing for infrastructure projects with China and with lots of money to do it.
So Africa has all these raw materials.
Yes.
And these raw materials are essential for the production of not only automobiles, cars, etc., but also a lot of the IT systems that we presently take for granted. I mean, I imagine companies like Apple will be feeling a bit insecure, particularly when I read today that China is restricting exports of some of these items already.
Yeah.
When the president hasn't taken office yet, and already China is signaling its intent here, which is you make a move against us, and boy, are you going to suffer from it.
Yes.
And that's going to be fascinating to see how that works out.
Yeah.
But leaving aside Africa, Africa has the raw materials, the resources there. So there is some security for African countries, maybe not all of them, but certainly some of them. What about Europe? I mean, what's your sense of what happens if there's a trade war that impacts not just Canada and Mexico and maybe China, but also Europe as well? What do you think will happen?
We're all in for a bit of a shock. I mean, I think it's probably quite for me as the thing, and obviously I'm an Africanist and I champion that actually people should, perhaps Europe should be, the competition should be for African consumers, to be honest. There is, when you talk about the demographics of Africa, you have got a lifetime of young people that are young, healthy, want education, want consumer goods, that are supremely connected. If that's the alternative to worrying about American tariffs. Africa is about to go has also got this Africa Continental Free Trade Arrangement that's being rolled out across the continent. And really, it's on the continent's doorstep. Literally Spain and Morocco really almost touch.
Yeah.
So it's right. It's, there some of the most interesting investment areas are right on the borders of Europe. But I definitely think everybody's in for a shock. And my concern is that this trade war will be yet another. It'll be, we've had COVID, and Africa really suffered. We've had COVID, we've had these external economic shocks, we've had Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the consequent fuel price. And we don't need now a trade war to be the third external, just as economies are beginning to recover. And I'm certainly feeling, certainly in the African sense, we're seeing quite a lot of recovery going on.
So we've got China investing, Russia with a huge involvement. They are doing that because they want to be positioned, I guess. In other words, they've looked at the likely outcome in the US and elsewhere. But also, as you say, they're uniquely better positioned when it comes to accessing that market with all of these young people, right? I mean, the education market alone must be enormous. And if that education can be delivered online, I mean, you're talking big bucks here. You're talking huge income.
Yes. I mean, incredible.
I don't see any evidence in Europe. I may have missed it, that European countries are saying, look, let's not trouble ourselves too much with here and there. Let's focus on Africa, where you've got all of these millions of people who are desperate to be educated. And if there's one resource that the UK has, it's education.
Yes, it's absolutely, you're absolutely right there. It is. And a lot of, I mean, coming back to the migrant issue, this education issue, a lot of people are migrating by whatever means, because, particularly in Eritrea, in difficult countries like Eritrea and in parts of Ethiopia, because there isn't a sufficient place for tertiary education or sufficient money for tertiary education. So, while primary education across the continent has vastly improved, and in certain countries, South Africa and Kenya, again, outstanding, North African countries got very good education systems. But, there is an education deficit in lots of the other African countries, and loads of people really wanting. And exactly as you say, online education is such an opportunity. But if you just even map out a modern consumer over the period of a lifetime, that's from 19 to 90, or the sort of I mean, let's say 70,
as score years in 10.
Yes, exactly. Say 70. Housing, cars, consumer goods, the opportunities are all there, and just waiting to be fed, if you like.
Are there any other players out there? Like, for example, if you look at the countries which will be effectively in a very significant position looking ahead, they have to include not just China, and obviously the US is still going to be around, but also India. Is there any Indian involvement in Africa?
Yes, it's quieter, but it's definitely there. And we see, and particularly, I mean, there's very long history between Africa and India. There's there was a lot of indentured labor brought from India during the colonial days to Mauritius, to South Africa, to work in the sugarcane in both Mauritius and so on. And you've got large communities of second and third generation Indians living in Kenya, Uganda, and so on. East African Asians is a very large community. Or in fact, very strong in East Africa, and with very strong links back to India. There's been a lot of talk about Mauritius recently, and concerns about China. About China's involvement in Mauritius, when really it's very much closer relationship with India. So, and India is Indian companies are there, and the big challenge to China there is again, it's a democracy, and a lot of the companies are private sector companies. So they will increasingly give Chinese companies a run for their money.
Yeah, interesting. And also, we've got a connection locally with the leader of the Conservative Party, who
Absolutely.
whose
Yeah.
pregnant mother moved
Yeah.
to Wimbledon, had a baby, i.e.,
Yes.
Miss Badenoch, and
Yeah.
then returned immediately, I think, almost immediately to Nigeria,
Yeah.
where she grew up for 16 years and
Yes.
is now making anti-immigrant speeches in the House of
I
Commons.
I find that quite devastating. I find it quite devastating that that somebody would do that, pulling up the drawbridge. But we've actually had, 3 very senior people four very senior people within the Conservative Party who are of immigrant, immigrant heritage, as am I. And, I consider myself an immigrant. Everywhere I go, I'm either
Yeah,
an immigrant or an immigrant. And so I find that very unappealing and unfair, and playing to a gallery
yeah,
a gallery. And I think that's a narrative that, out of urgency, because it plays into hostile foreign forces, including Russia, that it's something that it's a narrative that needs to be changed. And I think all parties need to change it, because our, English, UK universities are suffering because visas are not being granted to students anymore, and they are going elsewhere. And how will a productivity problem that the United Kingdom suffers be solved unless you have a robust education system and are attracting the world's best talent?
yeah. I mean, it often strikes me that Native Americans must be
Mm. Mm.
amused, if not having other emotions,
Yes.
when they
Mm.
listen to um, the, the, the next president
Yes.
bashing immigrants. They
Yeah.
must be thinking to themselves, "Well, hold on a second here.
Yeah.
Where
Yes.
did you come from?"
Yes.
And the
Quite.
answer is his mother came from
Yes.
Scotland illegally, and
Yes.
his father was German. So I mean, it must strike them as terribly ironic to hear this guy
Yes.
sounding off saying,
Yeah.
"We got to stop this immigration,"
Yeah.
and
Yes.
particularly when
Mm.
so many people in the States until recently were very proud of send me your huddled masses, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes. Yeah.
It's just very ironic.
And when you think back on where conservatism has gone, if you think about Ronald Reagan's last speech, which is very much available, where he actually talks about what really makes America great, was its ability, or is its ability, to self-generate
Yeah.
through immigration. That was his famous parting shot, was that America will always be great because it renews itself through an acceptance and openness to immigrants.
And here we have a situation where immigration is used as a cudgel to, you
Yes. Yeah.
and also as a means of grubbing votes from
Yeah.
wherever they might be, and appealing to people's baser instincts at the same time. And it's
Yes.
still reminiscent of the 1930s.
Yeah.
You have to hate the others, and the only way we can survive economically is by
Yeah.
putting up the barriers, having trade wars, it leads
Yeah.
to isolationism, and then you get a rerun of the 1930s when
Yes.
it's bigger your neighbour. And
Yes. Yeah. And it's the geopolitical fight really here is that I might be powerful enough to beggar my neighbor.
yeah,
So
yeah,
and that's on the global, on the geopolitical front, that is the big battle, in that is undermining, that was begun, I think, under George W. Bush, the undermining of multilateralism and institutions like the United Nations.
When you look at the BRICS countries,
Yes.
what future do you see for them, and what future do you see for Europe in the light of the changes that the BRICS might bring about?
Yeah.
And by BRICS, I mean Brazil, Russia, India,
Yes.
etc.
Yeah. Which they have expanded, and this is very much China's avenue to gain prominence. This is China dominated. It's it was, of course, a Goldman Sachs, as you know, it was a definition by Goldman Sachs, which is totally ironic. But now members is a whole load of new members, including those countries that I mentioned from the UAE, lots of the mid-sized countries that are coalescing around this BRICS grouping. And, they have a BRICS bank, which was meant to be a challenge to the World Bank, challenging all the institutions, creating parallel and mirror institutions. I think you've got a problem right from the start, and that comes down to the huge democracy that is India and the huge autocracy that is China. And it's like oil on water. And China, despite whatever the Communist Party says, is very much into making its presence felt on the global stage. Its actual policy, its propaganda policies are about undermining democracy and making democracy look unworkable, and I think probably in the future we will start seeing proxy wars as that proxy wars being started as that is propagated. But I think the real I don't think BRICS has any glue apart from China. Their main objective is really to form a currency that will challenge the dollar, to avoid international sanctions and that sort of thing. But I think it's there, and it is something that BRICS is an entity that Europe and the United Kingdom and all the players involved in the former West need to be active in engaging and persuading and so on. Part of what I feel is the answer to BRICS is to continue to make the democratic nations stronger. Our argument about democracy against the autocracies and that sort of thing has got to be to make our democracies much stronger. And that means serious political reform, and some of the institutional renewal that we could actually ironically look to the former colonies for inspiration, I would say.
Maybe the Turks and Caicos could help us out.
Perhaps. So, but I would argue that some of those islands, we're seeing a lot of China influencing areas such as the French overseas territories, the former colonies. Nouvelle Caledonie has been in uproar recently, and I suspect that's promoting this this demand for greater autonomy or whatever is very much part of that play.
Yeah, super. Look, this has been a fantastic. I mean, I should have said at the beginning, this hour will go very fast, and it has.
It's an hour.
I know, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I'm deeply indebted to you, Tara. It's been we aim to inform, educate, and entertain, and you've done all of that for us tonight. I'm sure there are a bunch of folks who had no idea how big Africa was and how big the influence of China is across the continent. And the fact that amongst the many things I've learned tonight is the medium age in Africa is 19 versus 47 in Europe. I mean, there's a lot of enormous capital in that statement alone. you can
Yes.
see where the future is, and you can see where the past is.
Yes, absolutely.
So
I
thank
hear
you.
you.
Thank you again.
Thank
I'll
you very
just say a
much.
few concluding remarks. If you can stay on the line for a little bit longer, I'd deeply appreciate it.
Mhm.
Well, there we are, folks. Thank you for joining us. We promise you a great guest every week, and we haven't failed you again. Thank you for joining us. Look after yourselves, stay safe, and take care. See you next Wednesday. We will have another star guest. Take care. Good night.